afternoon, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's been a fascinating discussion so far this morning, and there's been plenty of food for thought. And I'm looking forward to the next 90 minutes or so when we discuss climate finance in the MENA region and the challenges and opportunities that arise therefrom. It's a real pleasure to be hosting this particular panel with an esteemed and august group of panelists from across the region and representing a broad swathe of market participants and stakeholders in this vitally important area of discussion. I shall briefly introduce myself, and then I will introduce each of the panelists, and then I will give a brief introduction as to what we intend to discuss this morning before we get to the discussions. Well, my name is Matthew Eskrit, and I'm a partner in the banking and restructuring team at Pins & Masons in Dubai, and have been in the region for some 10 years now, and working on a whole range of financing projects. But one of the features of my practice over the last couple of years has been the increasing prevalence of renewable energy in that mix, and of course the growing interest in ESG, green finance, and sustainability-linked finance. With me today on the panel, we have Mr. Peter Smith, who is Head of Policy and Strategy at the Dubai Financial Services Authority. He is Head of Strategy and Policy and joined the DFSA in 2012. He's currently responsible for overseeing the regulator's strategic planning, its annual business planning cycle, and it has a particular interest in ESG matters and is instrumental in preparing the discussion papers on the matters that we are discussing today. We also have today Mr. Ahmed Kuchuk, who is Minister of Finance for Fiscal Policies and Institutional Reform in Egypt. He has been in that role since March 2016, and he has been playing a leading role in designing and implementing Egypt's macroeconomic policies and reforms, especially fiscal and debt policies. And I look forward to discussing in some detail with him his experiences on Egypt's groundbreaking Green Sukuk from 2020. I also have here Mr. Ibrahim Al-Zubi, who is Chief Sustainability Officer for Majid Al Futtaim Holding. In his current role, Ibrahim oversees the group-wide sustainability strategy of Majid Al Futtaim and is in charge of raising the company's sustainability profile in the Middle East and indeed globally. And one of his top priorities is to develop and drive the company's net positive sustainability strategy across the company's different business units. And it's great to have Majid Al Futtaim here because they are certainly one of the prime movers in this space in the ESG market in the last 2-3 years. And as Daniel Hanna was mentioning in his keynote earlier, this is absolutely essential that we have these first movers who effectively set the agenda and set the strategy for the Middle East going forward. And finally, and last but not least, and you will have heard him with his very interesting introduction and keynote this morning, we have Dr. Nasser Seidi, who is chairman of the CEBC, and he holds a number of directorships and board roles, including deputy chairman of Eureka Capital. He's a member of the IMF's Regional Advisory Group for MENA, a co-chair for the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, and is an expert in corporate governance, and is also a member of the advisory board of OMFIF. So we look forward to having his insights on a range of issues as we proceed with our discussion. This morning's discussions to date have been very wide-ranging and have given us a good deal of food for thought. Daniel Hanna's keynote a few minutes ago in particular gave certain sobering statistics in terms of the region's readiness for this momentous move that we all have to take, whether we like it or not. But at the same time, he left us with a good deal of room for optimism. And I hope in our discussion, we will come to a conclusion that there is a way through, and there is a way, and the panelists will be able to demonstrate the basis on which we can make that progress. I thought I would just start briefly by suggesting in a few words why this topic is quite so important for all of us listening. And briefly, what's at stake? There's a very interesting report that was commissioned by the British government, known as the Dasgupta report, which basically and very glaringly gives us a very simple truth, and that the solution that we need to achieve is starting with the accepting a simple truth that our economies are embedded within nature and not external to it, and protecting nature needs to become more valuable than exploiting it, and we need to embed institutional arrangements that protect public goods such as our oceans and the rainforests. And how we measure success needs to change, and nature needs to enter our economic and finance decision making in the same way that buildings, machines, roads, and human skills need to. And our global financial system is critical to supporting a more sustainable engagement with nature. And we need to build a financial system that channels financial investment towards economic activities that enhance our stock of natural assets and encourages sustainable production and consumption. And it's clear to us, and as has been demonstrated on the previous panels, governments, central banks, and regulators, international corporates and financial institutions all have a role to play in the transition to a more sustainable future. And I think, as I'm sure Ibrahim will be telling us, there's also increasing pressure on the private sector to be more purposeful and responsible in the way that they operate. And he will be able to talk to us about the concrete steps that their business is taking to achieve those goals. As has been mentioned, the MENA region is acutely exposed to many of the risks associated with climate change. And there's, notwithstanding the fact that there's some doubt as to the readiness of some of the economies of this region. And of course, it is a very diverse region with very wealthy OECD members and less wealthy members who are making great strides, but with more meager resources. But there's a general recognition amongst governments, regulators, and other market participants that the region should be and needs to assume a leadership role in transitioning towards a net zero future. And indeed, I think that's been demonstrated by the fact that Abu Dhabi is pitching for the COP28 summit. And it's, I think, incredibly important that this region becomes the center of that discussion as we proceed forward with our goals. And I think we've seen steady growth in green and sustainability linked products amongst market participants in recent years. And both debt products and indeed debt capital markets instruments are represented in that mix. You've seen the large lenders like FAB issuing green sukuks. You've obviously seen MAF issuing one, maybe two sukuks, in fact, and they were the market movers on that for the region with their 2019 issuance. And you've seen also a steady growth in sovereign issuances. And indeed, as we're going to discuss with Ahmed, Egypt issued a 750 million bond only last year. What has this been driven by? Of course, there's a variety of factors that are in play here. There's the growing importance of ESG considerations generally. I think there's also a desire to mitigate reputational risk. And frankly, there's also increased reporting and regulatory oversight. And let's be honest, there is also a commercial opportunity. And that is one of the things that I think we need to focus on as one of our discussion points. And these are the things I think that I would like to sort of highlight and people to have in mind when we're having this discussion is some of the key themes today. I think first and most importantly, inaction creates risks for the financial sector. I mean, as we've said, climate, the real economy, financial system are fundamentally interlinked. and we need to focus on this. Transition to net zero is a commercial opportunity to be seized, as well as being the right thing to do. A business which invests today will benefit from the transition to a more sustainable economy. And consumers and investors are becoming more climate aware, and this is increasingly affecting their spending and investment decisions. And divestment-only solutions are not a practical route to net zero. The FI sector will have to help steward a transition through an orderly economy-wide transition, so that you don't get the problem of stranded assets and you don't have the wider economic impacts of unemployment and loss of jobs that will lead to weakening of economies that will obviously impact their ability to fight and make these transitions. We're going to talk about the supervisory expectations on banks and financial institutions. And I think, as Daniel Hanna has said, and indeed Standard Chartered Bank has said a couple of times on this panel discussion to date, banks are expected to enhance their approaches to managing financial risks, and they're going to need to gather information from their clients about their exposures to and their management of climate-related risks and opportunities. And I think there's also going to be increasing focus on investor stewardship and the importance of disclosure, because asset owners, asset managers need to be able to make informed decisions about where to invest and maintain proactive oversight of those assets. And that sort of effective stewardship will encourage transition to net zero. And disclosure of climate risks is absolutely critical for consumers, businesses, investors and policymakers, so that they can make the right decisions. And I think it's inevitable that climate disclosure is likely to become one of the mandatory disclosures in the near future, as Dr. Saidi was saying earlier this morning. But this isn't a straightforward matter, as Peter will no doubt be telling us, because the problem we face globally is that there's no comprehensive and consistent taxonomy. And this does need to be developed together with global sustainability standards, which feeds into, obviously, the importance of independent verification and certification. So there's a lot to get through, and we're probably not going to solve all of these problems today, and we may not even be able to touch upon every single matter. But I'd like to sort of start with you, Peter. As from the regulator's perspective, you're primarily concerned with the impact of climate change on the economy and the financial system, and your job is to protect investors and market integrity. From your perspective, how are you seeing the development of the regulatory piece in the Middle East? And is it something that you think that the UAE is leading, and how much further do we need to go?
That's quite an interesting first question to start with. So thanks, Matthew, and thanks to the CEBC for inviting me to take part in this annual summit. Grateful for the opportunity. You're absolutely right, Matthew, that many of the things you've just mentioned, taxonomies, disclosures, verification methods, and so on, all require some sort of regulatory angle to it. It's not necessarily a regulatory angle that's going to come from organisations like ourselves, the DFSA. Some of it will come from political level regulators of the European Commission and organisations of that sort. Some of it will come from the supranational organisations. What's clear is that the Middle East is becoming increasingly active, I think, in this area. I think the UAE has taken some significant steps from a regulatory perspective and is keen to take more serious steps on just about all the fronts that you've mentioned already. The various things have already happened with declarations and so on. The Dubai Declaration in 2018, Abu Dhabi Declaration in 2019. I'm sure I got my years wrong there. the guiding principles that the UAE regulators group issued in early last year is an important step forward, and we've done further work on the back of that, including a survey conducted by all the regulators, the 5 of us who are in that group, as well as the markets in the UAE and a number of other participants, including the Ministry of Climate Change and the Environment. And so I think at the moment there's still information gathering and thoughts about what can be done and what can be done at the UAE level and what needs to be done at a broader level. I think everyone on the panel would accept that although countries can take sensible steps, real steps have to be broader than that. They have to be at least regional and ideally global. If you make the comparison with accounting standards, which is an obvious area to make a comparison with, we have 2 or 3 very large pools of accounting standards, and we need as a minimum, in my view, to get to that place in the ESG space as well, and we're still a long way to go. Conscious that everybody else will have comments on those things and others. I'll stop there, Matthew, but I'm happy to go into more detail on any of those points later.
No, that's been really interesting, and thank you for those insights, Peter. I mean, I think that ultimately what you're saying is absolutely right. I mean, there's only so much that individual countries, individual regulators can do to encourage these sorts of good behaviours, and that we are increasingly dependent upon international action and international decisions that will effectively allow us to ensure that there is a level playing field as much as anything else to assess climate compliance. Because I think, let's be honest, the other concern that we all face is that these need to be genuine steps. These need to be important transition linked and sustainability linked steps that will make measurable differences to the goals that we're trying to achieve. And this should not just be viewed as a marketing game or greenwashing, to use the more derogatory term. I mean, if you don't mind, Peter, I do want to sort of focus perhaps a little bit more on the regulatory sides just for the moment. But I mean, from my perspective, I guess I've got sort of 2 questions for you. The first relates to sort of transparency, and from your perspective, how does one go about promoting reliable and consistent disclosure in the marketplace, just in general terms?
Well, I mean, I think there's a very simple answer and the complicated reality, isn't there? The simple answer is we get reliable and consistent disclosure by all mandating consistent and sensible standards, and then policing whether those standards are better or not. So that's the easy bit. The more difficult bit is actually getting from where we are now to that point. And obviously, transparency in the ESG space and in the climate finance space has progressed down a number of paths. There are a number of competing options out there. The Climate Disclosure Standards Board, the CDP Worldwide, the TCFD disclosures. There's a number of competing options out there. The EU has put in place 2 directives and is looking at extending that further, some of which those came into force in March of this year. So as we stand today, we have a fragmented and inconsistent position globally and across regions indeed. We see coalitions forming, some of them, for example, in Southeast Asia under existing organisations, ASEAN. We see the European Union having set up the International Platform on Sustainable Finance, which is theoretically open to just about anybody as a way of trying to bring together thinking on this. But so I think from our position as a regulator, the recent developments from the IFRS are important with the proposed establishment of an International Sustainability Standards Board, because it is something that has to be done on a supranational level. And that ISSB's task to develop a common sustainability-related reporting standard, which will obviously build on the private sector initiatives and the public sector initiatives that have obviously taken place, is, I think, a crucial step in the right direction, and likely to be very, very impactful into the medium term. A prototype was set out in December of last year, which is supported by many of the significant players, both private and public. and hopefully that provides the foundations for that International Sustainability Standards Board to move forward and deliver something that is absolutely necessary. Clearly, as with anything of this sort, there will be much politicking and debate, and Ahmed is probably better placed to comment on that than I am. But there will inevitably be politics involved, and people will choose to push particular self-interest angles. But we can only hope, sitting where we do, that the prevailing need for common standards in all our common good will outweigh those, if I can call them, minor political points and angles that people will no doubt wish to push. So I think on transparency, reliable and consistent disclosure can only emerge when there are consistent and sensible standards in place and mechanisms for policing them.
That's fascinating, and I guess that sort of kind of already answers to some degree my second question, which was more about trust and how does one, as a regulator, because you can't force, you have to encourage, you have to push, you have to sort of effectively provide the software, the framework for the right sorts of to encourage the right sorts of behaviors. But how does a regulator push the market to deliver products that genuinely meet investors' sustainability preferences? And I mean, I suppose the corollary of that is, will we go from doing the right thing to mandatory at some point?
I think in most of these areas, in most jurisdictions, we will move either directly from do the right thing to mandatory, or through the slightly longer sequence of do the right thing, stop 2 on the journey, comply or explain, stop 3 on the journey, mandatory. So I think there are those two routes that people will choose depending on their preferences. I mean, I think the financial services industry generally produces products that meet at least meet enough of their investors' preferences, I think is the right way to put it. They may not meet all of their investors' preferences, but they meet enough of their investors' preferences for investors to actually buy them. If they didn't meet any of the preferences, existing preferences, then nobody would ever buy anything, would they? So you're not starting with a completely blank sheet of paper. But nonetheless, I do think some of the preferences are expressed differently and need to be tested differently in the ESG space than in the, let's say, retirement planning space or whatever other area you want to talk about. I think for us as regulators, a part of it comes back again to making sure that the labels are right. So disclosure to some extent. Do the labels actually describe the contents accurately? The question of what the contents actually are, I think we're more likely to leave to third-party verification, and independent verification, which you've already referred to, rather than dive deeply into the contents ourselves. But the way those contents are described is very much a matter of interest for regulators. And the only way we can build trust that investors' preferences will be met, particularly as the new generation, the millennial investors and so on, who have strong preferences in this area, come into the market, the only way we can build trust is by walking the walk. We can all talk the talk, we've all done lots of that, no doubt, but we've got to walk the walk as well. You've got to actually put products out there. Ibrahim's got to issue a bond, Ahmed's got to issue a bond, and it's got to do what it says. The processes have to be demonstrably used for the things that the investors think it's going to be used for. And people will be able to see that through verification or some other methodology. And the only way you can build, and I think it's a challenge for everyone, because no doubt there will be people in various parts of the world who will see this as an opportunity for less well-motivated actions, if I can put it that way, or fraud, or whatever you want to call it. There will be that. And so we've got the usual quite fragile balance between trying to build investor trust in a new market, which is obviously what we all want to happen, but doing that in a way where there is enough transparency, enough information that people can look back and say, yes, Majid Al Futtaim does what it says it will do when it issues a green bond. Sorry, Ibrahim, I'm not picking on you, but it's an obvious example. But you know, and people have to be able to answer that question. You have to be able to stand up at an annual general meeting or in an annual report and say, in our sustainability report, we issued 3 green bonds. This is what we did with them. Bang, bang, bang. You know, and you've got to be, and that's got to be tested and verified. And all we can hope for is that the majority of things that are tested and verified are proved to be correct. And do what they said they would do. So, and our regulators have a role to play in that, but so do investors and other parties as well. The point you made earlier about, you know, investor action in this area is really crucial.
No, I absolutely think that's vital to all of this, and I think that companies that don't take this seriously are going to start paying a price in due course, and in terms of their cost of funding, indeed the availability of funding. I want to turn to Ibrahim here, and thank you, Peter. We could spend an awful lot of time talking about a lot of these issues, but obviously we've got a lot to get through. And turning to Majid Al Fatim, Ibrahim. So as I said, we've seen increasing interest amongst market participants in sustainability-linked products and a slew of corporate issuances in the last 2 or 3 years. And you as a company led by example with your first corporate benchmark Green Sukuk in 2019. And you've also been a first mover in integrating ESG objectives into your governance, your company strategy, and the risk management procedures. And you've made very public your promise and commitment to that net positive strategy of 2014. If I can just ask you a very open, obvious question. So what is driving MAF to do this?
First of all, thank you very much for CEBC and everyone for this very interesting discussion. First of all, as a sustainability practitioner, it's music to my ears when to listen to yourself, Peter, and of course what Ahmed will mention and Dr. Nasser, because it makes a lot of sense when it comes out of you guys, not from a sustainability practitioner, that it does make financial sense. What you've been describing from a regulator or from what Daniel as well mentioned from banking, it is the new business model. It's the sustainable business model that everyone talks about, even the green comeback post-COVID-19. So last year, if we look at it, it's been a very tough year. It's a very different year, but it's exposed the deep underlying problems that we have in be it public crisis management systems or inequalities. And as much it was challenging, we've seen an acceleration in business consciousness, a trend that was already underway even before the pandemic. The companies now, private sector, and Majid Al Fatim is part of it. We are reevaluating our organization's sense of purpose and feeling the need to address social, environmental, as well as economic issues. So we've seen a shift of shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism, and it is well underway. So the environmental awareness is not about it's a nice thing to do. It's about creating a resilience and agility in our new business model. Having said that, the journey of sustainability of Majid Al Fatim started 10 years ago. And why that time decided to do that through different internal stakeholder engagement that I've been running, 5 main reasons. 1, access to capital, cost savings, long-term profitability. So this is what we like to hear, and I'm sure that all the banking, everyone in the business like to hear. But also, it's also brand reputation. We've seen a shift in the population, global population. Let's say talk about the MENA population, which made more than 50% under the age of 30 years old. They want to work for a sense of purpose companies. They want to buy from sustainably led companies. So brand reputation is a main thing, one of the drivers. And the 5th one, of course, corporate citizenship. Like we are part of what's going on. And I think what COVID-19 showed that we were right when it came to that. If one falls, we all fall. So that's for maybe health. But let me tell you something. Climate change is a pandemic. We always believed it's a pandemic. I believe it is so far it's the pandemic that we've been living in. Look around, look at the droughts, look at the water force, look at what geopolitical things happening in our region. So what we looked at it that time, we believe that climate change will have an impact on our vision, which is creating great homes for everyone every day, as well as it will have a business impact. So we've decided to look into integrate this into our risk and opportunities and compliance as well. We predicted what a good future will look like, what government consciousness will look like, and they may implement regulations such as the green building regulations, such as labor, human rights, diversity and inclusion, you name it. And we've decided to come up with, look at the next 25 years and integrate sustainability in every single decision we do and we take as an organization. Having said that, through the journey for the last 10 years and going forward from our net positive commitment, I believe the best thing I personally did with work within the organization is working with our treasury and finance team, because I stopped talking to the boards. I stopped talking external because the board they believed in it. We have top-down, bottom-up approach, but we started going out to investors and having access to capital because we included sustainability. Now, what Peter mentioned, and I about regulation, about transparency, about reporting, by the way, it's there. It's just was about a matter of investors, banking, regulators, and getting a pilot. And the good thing about this, and I think if MENA or Egypt and among other organizations within the region, what we proved that it can be done, and it should be the way forward. We shouldn't go back to the normal business, which is the investors, the bonds. We should look at green bonds. We should look at ESG related loans. We should look at green loans, green financing. That should be the new norm if we want to mitigate the future, the impacts of climate change, which we all agree that it is impacting us. Last but not least, the whole world, the whole governments of the world decided to integrate and give commitments on the SDGs. And people don't talk a lot about the Sustainable Development Goals. And by the way, I'm sure maybe Daniel or some of the colleagues of the banking stakeholders, they can talk about SDGs related bonds as well. SDGs are one of the main common language that public sector and private sector talks. Our sustainability strategy aligns directly with 10 of the 17 SDGs, which became the translator of our work within the government. When we go on outreach, we talk to government, public sectors, intergovernmental organizations, financial institutions. So we have clear KPIs related to SDGs, related to sustainability, and aligned with the business objectives, which again made a lot of business sense. It brought us more customers. It brought us, there is a return on investment, there is cost savings, as well as we are practicing our role as part of the community. It's a win-win for us, good for the community, the environment, and good for the business.
That's fantastic, Ibrahim, and thank you very much for explaining so lucidly why MAF has taken this road. And just forgive me for focusing on this, but can you just give me one concrete example of how your business processes have changed, and one example of what opportunities you have seen for the business following from embedding ESG principles into the DNA of your business?
Absolutely. Let's start when we said not even one decision we take it relates to sustainability. So we have an investment and a sustainable checklist when we acquire anything, either be it a land or decide on a business. Let's talk about a shopping mall, for example. We introduced the checklist for our business development teams and research and intelligence unit when it comes to development team. They go through the checklist to ensure that, one, we will achieve the shopping malls, the development and project management team will achieve their target when it comes to the green sustainable building policy, which is building LEED Gold certified. Also, then they look at the labor conditions, which as per our human rights and employee accommodation policy, that tier 1, that we did not impact the human rights, we did not impact employee conditions, did we create jobs or not? Do we achieve our socio-economic impact criteria, as well as investment internally in on-site generations for renewables, or partnering with national and local startups for off-site generation. So this all can be done way before, through the due diligence process of our project investments, which will create jobs, will help the economy, as well as will achieve our green building targets. The other part I can give you an example of, which means that when it comes to the social part, the socio-economic, creating jobs, but also we look at diversity and inclusion. We look at the commitments, which how many jobs we created, what kind of gender equality we had, did we do localization, did we achieve our localization targets or not, did we support the in investing with the governments in infrastructure, and how much we invested in infrastructure, how many people benefited outside our project, or how many people will benefit of outside this project of this. A good example, if you live in Dubai, the flyover of Mall of the Emirates that we invested on the bridge created what we know now as Barsha, as Big Barsha, for example, which is a huge neighborhood now, initially triggered by building a Mall of the Emirates, as well as the investing in the infrastructure, either it's a bridge or a flyover when it comes to infrastructure. So that's one part. The other part is we look at the overall sustainability targets. So it gets audited externally every quarter, gets assured as well. So when it comes to clean audited data for the last couple of years, these overall targets, we have a percentage that goes to the C-suite N-1 on the overall that the company must achieve, and it goes into their remuneration. That's what we do. Now, when it comes to ESG, by the way, we have 2 ESG rating by third party, as Peter mentioned, by Sustainalytics and MSCI. We're rated as A by MSCI and low risk by Sustainalytics. So it goes to ESGs, of course, it goes to the different governance, social and environmental part, and it's publicly listed. It's third party opinion. It's there on the website, along with data and reports for the last 10 years.
Okay, thank you. And just that's fantastic. And just picking up something that Daniel Hanna said in his keynote a few minutes ago. I mean, how is MAF encouraging its business partners and its supply chain to adopt similar practices in their own businesses? Because presumably that's one of the things that we were discussing in the previous panel discussion, which is the sort of the viral spread of good behaviors and the right thing to do. And people like Majid Al Futtaim, who have the sort of foresight and also, to be honest, the management direction and indeed the financial resources to lead by example. How do you encourage your business suppliers and your supply chain to follow suit?
Awareness, engagement, and policies. So what we do, because I've mentioned that this should be the norm. So what we've done is we started engaging with our tier 1 supply chain to start with on different topics. Our first topic was 10 years ago in the GCC employee accommodation. And we worked with them on a voluntary basis how we can integrate the ILO and the local regulations as a minimum within our Majd Futtaim standards. Now we have a sustainable procurement policy, a sustainable supply chain policy when it comes to the sustainability policy that the supply chain have, procuring locally and regionally, procuring environment friendly, and procuring with human rights standards as well. So now, after a couple of years working and engaging with awareness and everything, if any supply chain would like to work with Majd Al Futtaim, they have to implement and apply our sustainable procurement and supply chain policy, which, by the way, we audit on a quarterly basis. And if they don't comply, they simply lose the contract as per the contracts we have with them. So we went beyond asking a simple question, which, by the way, can make a big difference, asking the supply chain, do you have a sustainability statement, which I think everyone should ask. But also, we started in education engagement and working with them, not only with our supply chain, but also with our tenants. So, for example, we work with all our tenants as free of charge consultants on the Sustainable Fit Out Guide. We help them to achieve star rating fit outs, and I'm glad we have Ahmed. For example, in our Mall of Egypt, our supply in Egypt, and all of them Egyptian companies, they achieved a full 5-star rating when it comes to sustainable fit out in our food court. So the food court in Mall of Egypt, with all the F&B outlets, working with our partners, tenants, they achieved the highest rating when it comes to sustainability, which means water reduction, carbon reduction, as well as engaging awareness for their own staff. And that's the norm now. That's the policy. You want to open a shop with us, minimum you need to achieve 3-star rating in our shopping centers, wherever we are.
Thank you, Ibrahim. Mr. Kuchuk, Ahmed, if I could turn to you in Egypt, if that's all right, and thank you for your patience. It's been fascinating so far to hear the views of Peter and Ibrahim, and I'm looking forward to hearing your own experiences in the context of the Egyptian approach. Now, as I've said earlier, I mean, we've seen sovereign green bond issuance soar in 2020, which in and of itself is a very positive development, and I think we should all be excited about that. And I think that there is reason to be quietly optimistic that that direction of travel will continue. And it's great to see that Egypt became the first Arab country to issue a green bond last year for $750 million deal. And I think it's very clear that it flags your commitment as a government to sustainability and also to diversifying your investor base. And the proceeds of that issuance are going to be used to finance green projects in sectors such as transportation, renewable energy, and indeed energy efficiency. Now, if I can also ask you an open question to begin, and just very general terms, and what are the key learning experiences for you and for your government from this debt issuance?
Thank you, Matthew, and thank you for also all the participants today, including Daniel, in the keynote speech. Was very interesting remarks. Peter and Ibrahim also gave us a lot of different dimensions from the regulatory point of view, as well as from the private sector point of view, and very, very interesting developments. And I think what I want to say to address your question is that this is a very important topic: sustainability, climate change, dealing with all the challenges arising from that. It's a collective effort, and we all have a big part to play with it: the government, the private sector, the regulatory bodies, all the international financial institutions, the regional institutions. It's a very collective effort, and unless we all join efforts, it's not easy. Especially after COVID, you will find a lot of more challenges for a lot of countries and governments and private sector, and you're adding additional challenges to already a very existing or very high aspiration for the people in the region. So it's very important to keep this in mind. My second point: what are the lessons learned? There are a lot to be shared, but let me tell you two things. That first of all, there are two different aspects. There is the willingness and the commitment, but there is also the ability of delivering, and it's very similar to what Peter said: talking the talk and walking the walk. It's the two are very important. You will not walk unless you have a certain direction or certain decision to move in that direction. But also, the process and your journey is a very learning process, and you learn a lot. You will not be able to learn the full cycle and get the full experience unless you start implementing and start working on the ground and start delivering. So it's very important to have these two concepts in place. I think in our case, for us to have the ability to do and to deliver and to issue our first sovereign green bond was a journey that preceded a lot of efforts, including repricing our energy mix in the right way that led to a big reduction in the consumption of gasoline and other fuel products that we want to limit. There was also a big investment by the government in renewables. Just for you to understand the significance of what I'm saying, Egypt, the share of renewables in electricity generation was less than 1% only 7 or 8 years ago. Now we're talking about 11% in 2019, 12% in 2019, and we are approaching the 20% by the end of 2022, June 2022. And our target now is to take this to around 35%, to around 40% by 2035. This is commitment announced by the government, but not only a commitment, this is commitment, and now we are seeing delivery and we're seeing an achievement there. A lot of the upgrading the infrastructure and streamlining what's there. So there was a lot of preparatory work for us to go and deliver. It's not only the ability and it's the willingness and to have a lot of work. So one thing that we have learned from this process is that we need to bring everybody around the table. We need to a lot of preparatory work is needed. You need to have the right partner with you. You need to choose the right partners. It's not an easy process. It's something that you want to do, but it's not an easy process. So you need to have the partners, but you need to have the story. So for the story to be there, you need the partners and you need to do that. So one thing that we have maybe did well in that regard is that we have created this interministerial committees that allow us to sit together, discuss things, collect the information, debate things in a very easy and in a very open environment, and it's a learning curve and a learning experience. And again, bringing the right partners with you facilitate this, enable you to better understand the process, better understand the challenges, and also give you solutions and options. So it's a very collective effort, but it's also require commitment and require walking the walk, as being said, because unless we do that, we will always be shying from facing those challenges and really putting our extra effort toward that direction.
Thank you, Ahmed. That's very interesting insights that you shared with us in the context of the motivations and the drivers that have driven this exciting development. And yeah, it's extraordinary and also very exciting to see how quickly things that seemed impossible only 10 or 15 years ago, which was a sizable contribution of renewables to the energy mix in this region, have so quickly changed. And that, for me, is an object lesson into what we have to sort of is in what is actually possible. And it's very easy to sort of give up and say things are not going to be achievable. But I think what we're seeing is that actually we put our minds to something with sufficient focus and drive and determination, and that journey will begin. Now, from my perspective, one question that I had furthered was that, I mean, how would you, I mean, I hope it's a question that you can answer, but from the point of view of investor engagement, I mean, how was it different in the context of this green debt issuance? And I mean, did you achieve your goal of diversifying your investor base in consequence and source of funding?
Absolutely. Of course, we have leveraged our very strong team that is with me in this room that has been engaging with investors for the last years. But this transaction, the green bond transaction specifically, which is, by the way, is only a milestone transaction, but this means that we have a very good ambition plan for the next years, and this will be part of our normal issuances, not only from the government perspective, but also from the private sector perspective. Within this transaction, one of the main achievements, or one of the main reasons, is to create a benchmark for the private sector in Egypt, as well as for other government entities in Egypt to explore this option. But coming to your question, the transaction itself paid off tremendously. Yes, we did a lot of effort, pre-issuance to deal and to talk to investors in a very open way, to address their questions, their inquiries, and in a very transparent way. We didn't say that we have everything right and that all our ambitions are there, but also we were able to show them a story that says that proves that Egypt in 5 or 10 or 6 years was able to make big achievements, supported by numbers, supported by figures, and supported by reality. They can come and see, and it's not only government statements, it's a reality on the ground, backed by outcomes. And out of that, we were able to bring, for the first time, we had, of course, a very strong coverage. We have four times coverage in our bond issuances, in our green bond issuance, but and we were able also to bring the cost compared to even our secondary market prices at that time. But also we were able to bring 16 new investors for the first time to invest in our international bond issuances, and we are a regular bond issuer. So to bring this number, it means that those are investors that came because of the green bond issuance, or the labeling, or the instrument itself. And we were able also to bring a larger number of existing investors, but they came through their also sustainable arm or sustainable funds, dedicated funds. So overall, yes, there was more investors coming to Egypt. We have widened our investor base. We were able to have a very strong coverage, and we were able to bring Egypt to on the radar of this very growing and sophisticated investor base globally. So yes, even from a debt management perspective, there was a lot of success and a lot of achievements for us that is worth all the effort that was done, as well as that's being done now to maintain the communication with the investors.
Thank you, Ahmet. And I think that's, for me, an object lesson in the attractiveness and the appetite for these products. The fact that you are oversubscribed and that you've effectively tapped into a whole new source of funding in the context of these instruments. And it suggests to me, therefore, that you see, as a country, as a government, rich opportunities going forward for green and sustainability-linked issuances.
Correct. There is a lot that we can do, and a lot we can benefit from, and we are working now even on a broader perspective on the sustainability development financing, and there is a lot of innovative tools and financing that is there that can help countries bridge the gap between their aspirations and the existing financing that will enable that. But again, as I told you, also we have to keep in mind that this is not a process that you can deliver without real work on the ground. So it's a collective effort, and the awareness and the engagement with our government counterparts is key. Because I mean, for us to do a regular issuances, whether from even the private sector or the government, we need pipeline, we need more projects, we need more work on the ground, we need to have more delivery. And so things that's done by the private sector, like El Futain, which is doing great in Egypt and doing a lot of work here also, and all the learning that they are doing to the suppliers, our regulatory bodies also that is now engaging. We even at the government now in our budget, in our own budget, we have at least 20% of all our investment or projects financed by the budget have now is now what they call it. They are all have met all the criteria that we have set. We have issued a manual that give more privilege and more, I would say not privilege, that enable the government to give more weight for projects that would fit also all the sustainability indicators. And for those projects, we give them priority in our financing and funding. And also now we have almost more than 1/5 of our whole budget, capital projects financed by the budget are also fitting or eligible to this criteria. So we will put more and more weight there. And hopefully by doing that, all of us together, we will be in a much better position in the next years.
Thank you, Ahmed. Thank you indeed for those insights. Dr. Saidi, if I can turn to you, and thank you again for your patience in the context of this discussion. It's been fascinating that we've heard from the regulator, we've heard from the private sector, and we've also heard from a government, a major government in the Middle East, and the steps that they're taking to head down this very important road. Now, we've talked, I think, on a number of occasions this morning and indeed this afternoon about the importance of the financial sector in facilitating this transition, and particularly banks as one of the primary stores of capital in the financial system. I mean, they are, let's face it, going to be essential in facilitating that transition to net zero and ensuring ESG goals are embedded into businesses that they support. And in the absence of a bank, and apologies if I'm putting you on the spot here, but I just wonder from your own perspective how you think banks can best use that very important leverage that they have to encourage the growth of green and as Daniel said earlier, importantly, transition finance and sustainability linked finance. What in your view can banks do? And
I think the financial tools, along with the fiscal tools, are probably going to be the critical tools that will drive us along the path of decarbonization. And let me explain. If you think about the fiscal tools to begin with, because those are critical, you need to think about how you're going to be pricing carbon risk, right? That is the essential thing. At the moment, we are not adequately pricing carbon risk. We're not taking it into account in our business decisions or even in our private household decisions. So what you need to do, of course, is to recognize those risks and price them accordingly. And the market will head in that direction. We need to help it. And one way to help it, of course, is through a carbon tax. So one thing on the agenda for all of us, for all countries, but particularly in this part of the world where we continue to subsidize fossil fuels, is to shift away from fossil fuel subsidies to begin with, phasing out, but then deliberately introduce a carbon tax. Once you introduce a carbon tax, automatically the prices of inputs as well as outputs that have a large carbon content are going to increase. That's going to affect your markets, it's going to affect your trade, it's going to affect the whole supply chain automatically. So a carbon tax, a fiscal tool, is going to be extremely important. But the other one, and the reason why it becomes so important, is that it is automatic. You don't need to tell somebody you have to do something. The price takes care of it. The market price takes care of it. But the other side, I think, is what Peter was talking about, and the markets and the banks. Here, I think the role will be critical. And if I want to compare it to anything, it'll be similar to what we've done with corporate governance. Initially, corporate governance was thought of, well, that's a nice thing to have, right? I mean, it's good for your reputation. You'll have a couple of more women on boards. You'll have some NEDs. You'll have some more disclosure, transparency, etc. All the paraphernalia of corporate governance. It was good to have. And you were deemed to be a good corporate citizen, etc. But then we discovered that during the great financial crisis, that corporate governance risk is market risk. And that if you have a failure of a major bank or financial institution, that hits the whole banking and financial system. We learned that at a great expense. Remember, it was the biggest financial.
We lost you there, Dr. Saidi.
Be the first thing, but the second thing is, and I think this probably comes more from what Ibrahim and Ahmed have said, is I would say to market participants, get on the train or it's going to leave you behind, because there's already a lot of activity going on. As Dr. Nasser, I think, was just starting to say, there's going to be more pushing and forcing to get you on the train. So get on the train now while you still can, and you can then learn and get up this learning curve that we all need to get up more quickly than perhaps the 10 years that Majid Al Futtaim have been working on this, you know. And I think it's you know, everyone has a part to play to this, all market participants in different ways. And I think it's important that we all recognize that and that we all step up and help to address these challenges. But I say I am optimistic.
Thank you, Peter. Dr. Saidi, yes, I think you're back. We're live.
Just pointing to the fact that the banks and the markets are going to have a critical role to play, and I was comparing it to corporate governance, which went through different stages. A nice thing to have, then it was therefore purely voluntary, then comply or explain, and then mandatory. I think this is where we're going to be heading. But of course, the regulators set the standard, right? But it is the banks that are going to ensure compliance. So they're going to translate it down into requirements from their clients for the credits that they give, for the mergers and acquisitions that they finance, and across the whole banking spectrum. I think that's only one part. You need to prepare for that from now. What that means for businesses is you've got to have a framework already in place for decarbonizing yourself, your company. Just like Egypt and all other countries are going to have a decarbonization path, you have to have a decarbonization path for your own company. It needs to address the issues of policy and legal risks that you might have if you don't, technology risks, because you take, for example, electric cars, they're going to be fully competitive with fossil fuel, with carbon emitting cars within 2 years, right? With internal combustion engines. You need to think about how the market itself is changing. Young people today are no longer going to accept what we accepted. They want a cleaner atmosphere. They want to have products and services that are compliant with carbon de-risking. And then you've got your own reputational risks of your products and of your company. So all of those will need to go into your framework. And your bank is going to be asking you questions about that. And if the bank does not do that, the bank itself will suffer. So what you're going to have is moving down the whole supply chain into the businesses across through the banking system. I think that is one component, but it's not the only component. The other component, I think, is financial markets. And here, I think two things are very interesting. If you look at total assets under management today, they're a little bit over 100 trillion. Some 50 trillion of that is now run by asset managers who have committed to
It looks unfortunately like we may have lost Dr. Saidi again. So apologies for that, for the technical difficulties. Ibrahim, final word from you. I mean, if I could ask you for a key message that you would give to attendees here about your own experiences and MAF's experiences in this sector and what we should all be doing in that context.
Well, briefly, I fully agree with Peter. I think we're all aligned here. I think it's time for us to discuss the how and the opportunities, and that's what we should discuss. I'll leave you with the fact about the opportunities that we have. You know, the green bond market reached a new record as Q3 2020 issuance peaked at around $64 billion, the highest volume in any third quarter period since market inception, and that tells you a lot. It tells you the commitment, it tells you the market, it tells you the opportunities, and that where the world is going ahead. And I really like what Peter mentioned about the train. If you want to be part of a future, an existing and sustainable economy, there is no plan B. This is the only way to sustain your business and to be, and if you want, in the business atmosphere for the coming 10 to 15 years. And we heard from Ahmed from a government level that it does work. We've seen many examples from Daniel in today's panel. Now it's time to walk the walk and discuss on how not only how we can all achieve a net zero, how we can implement a strategy for green tech, how to create a post-COVID-19 sustainable economy.
Thank you, Ibrahim. That's appreciated, and thank you for those insights. Dr. Saidi, are you back?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
I don't know. Technology isn't always a handmaiden.
It's fine. Just carry on where you left off. We've got a couple of extra minutes, so don't worry.
Let me point to the importance of the markets. I mentioned that 50 trillion now is in the hands of investors that want to look at decarbonization. So the market that Egypt tapped is going to be a market that's rapidly growing. So let's understand what is at stake. What is at stake is that the cost of credit to anything that is carbon heavy is going to be rising, right? So increasingly, banks, financial institutions will be cutting down investment in fossil fuel and carbon heavy industries and businesses. So you need to prepare yourself for that. On the other side, I think, and this is where it's critically important, is the markets. The markets are going to put a premium on going for green new deals and blue new deals in terms of investing in new technologies. We've seen that in renewables. I think that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's going to be a major transformation. Remember that it has to do with our transport sector, our buildings, our industry and manufacturing, the way we live. And therefore, we're going to have to commit enormous resources. And those are going to have to come through the financial markets, much less so than through the banks. The banks are going to be excellent for driving credit away from carbon heavy toward carbon light, right? But it's the markets where we need to put in the major effort. That's where you're going to have green development banks. That's why green bonds or sukuk are going to be critical. But at the same time, we need verification. We need verification. We need to be able to avoid greenwashing. I think that is a major issue. And therefore, the framework that you're going to have for disclosure is going to be a critical one. We're going to need something coming out of the BIS. We're going to need something coming out of IOSCO. And we're going to need IFRS, US GAAP, and all the others to provide the underlying accounting framework. If we don't have a comprehensive, agreed upon accounting framework, to measure the risks, see how they translate into the prices of assets, we're not going to get very far. So the accounting standards are going to be a bedrock, because no regulator is going to be able to issue standards for disclosure and all the rest if you don't know how to account for it. If you can't account, nobody's going to take it into account. So I think that is going to be critical. So what I'm saying is several things. Accounting standards is going to be important. Disclosure standards is another building block. What the regulators do, both for the banking and financial industry, but also for the markets, is going to be critical to drive us forward. But even then, I think what's probably going to drive it most forward is people, investors and people. And people's preferences are changing. We've already seen that. And I think COVID drove home that point, that you're exposed to pandemic risk, COVID risk, that can mean death for you. This message came very clear to people. And so they started protecting themselves. And it was self-protection, which was very important. Then you go on to crowd level protection, you get vaccines. We're not there yet for climate, but the mood is changing. So everybody is now much more aware of the carbon content of anything they're consuming, using, or investing in. I think that will drive the markets to provide more of those carbon neutral or light carbon products and services as we move along. And I think the beauty of it is that technology is already there. Technology is already there. Whether you're talking about the transport system, buildings, energy efficiency and the like, the technology is already there. However, I don't think we should pin all our hopes on the technology. It's nice to be optimistic, but our human animals, the human animal has always felt that technology is the answer to everything. Matthew, you started off by pointing to the Dasgupta report, and that's absolutely right. We're not the only animals on Earth. There are all the others, and biodiversity is what allows us to survive. If we don't have the bees, we are dead. That's to put it simply. So what you need to think of is not only what you're doing as a human animal, you need to think of natural capital. So I think what we're going to go into is saying, how do I use technology intelligently? How do I rebuild the natural capital that we've been destroying and applauding ourselves for high levels of GDP growth, whereas we've been depleting natural capital? We've been using, for example, our oil and gas, right? And we have high growth. But you used an asset just like you used your house and sold part of your house. Eventually, the floor is no longer there. So what I think we need to hope for is shift in preferences, but also using technology. And I think if I look at young people today, then I tend to be optimistic. But I wouldn't pin it all on technology. I think we need to change our behavior. I think that's critical. And the key to changing our behavior is, I think, pricing carbon. Whether you do it through a carbon tax, you do it through other forms, or you get your regulators to tell the banks, price it accordingly. Otherwise, you are at risk yourself, because the climate risks will translate into financial risks, and then you can have a major financial crisis. Just think of how much exposure banks have to the oil and gas industry, particularly in our region. If those assets start becoming stranded assets, then what you're talking about is a write-down of most of the wealth of our region. And that, I think, is a central message we need to be careful about. You have to start the transformation from now.
Thank you, Dr. Saidi, for these vitally important insights and absolutely essential observation that fundamentally we operate within nature, not without it, and that we need to engage much more sustainably with those assets, not just for our own good, but for the good of the generations that will follow us. And we are ultimately responsible for the world that we leave behind to our children, our grandchildren. And on that note, Ahmed, if I can just turn to you, because we are 1 minute left, Ahmed, because I want to just give you one final comment before we wrap up. In the context of what Dr. Saidi was saying, presumably you would agree, given your beautiful and history and the beauty of your natural world around in Egypt in particular, what we need to change ultimately is nature needs to get back into the heart of the way we make economic and financial decisions, doesn't it? And I think these instruments that we're talking about are helping us slowly but surely facilitate that journey.
Of course, this is the final outcome and the final the end result, and that's why it's very important that we streamline environmental and sustainable dimensions in our work, whether at the Ministry of Finance. We don't need the old system where you have one central way of ministry thinking about about this issue. The issue is that we can do a lot in every single dimension in our daily habits, in our daily work, in our daily development. So I think this is required that we streamline really in our daily work and in all dimensions of our work, private sector, government, financial institutions, international institutions, the environmental and the sustainable development perspective. And by doing that, this will itself create the right momentum and the right force for us to move in the right direction with the right speed.
Thank you, Ahmed, and we'll leave it there because we are certainly out of time. So thank you all to the participants for the fascinating insights that they have shared with us today. I don't know about you, but I've certainly learned a lot, and it's been a really productive discussion. And I think we end it with a degree of optimism for the journey ahead. And I think that's what we all need to hold on to. This is a soluble problem. We have the technology and we know what to do. It's just about changing behaviors at every level, both governmental, regulatory, and in terms of the private sector. But also, let's be honest, each and every one of us needs to think carefully about the steps that we can take ourselves to improve things. So thank you, CEBC, and I look forward to the remainder of the discussion. It's been fascinating so far. So thank you all and goodbye.